All right, so I think we started this last time, but I don't think we finished it. That he prohibited us from making a laceration for the dead in our flesh, like the idol worshippers do. So again, he connects this to idolatry, but apparently they, upon hearing about the death of a relative, would cut into their skin, and that would leave like a permanent scar, and it would be a sign of mourning. And this is his may be exalted, saying, you shall not gash yourself. And the prohibition, so the Hebrew word is lo tit godadu. You shall not gash yourselves. This is going to be example of a mitzvah that has two seemingly unrelated prohibitions coming out of the same word. And this one is lashing yourself. The prohibition about this was already repeated with his saying, you shall not make any lacerations to your flesh for the dead. And it's already been explained in the Gemara in Yevamos that the essence of the verse, you shall not gash yourself, is that you shouldn't make a wound. And there it says you should not gash yourself is required for itself, as saying, do not make a wound for a corpse. Again, last time I pointed out, they don't mean a wound on a corpse. They mean a wound because somebody died. And in the Gemara, they said a laceration and a gash are the same. And there it is explained that one who makes a gash for a corpse is liable whether it was done with your hand or with a tool. But for idolatry, one is liable with a tool, but not by hand. As appears explicitly in prophecy, they gashed themselves according to their practice with knives. They've already said in Yevamos that this includes. All right, so now that was a very specific practice and seems to have a very limited application. But then he quotes, and they've already said that included in this prohibition of disunity in the religious practices of the city and divisions into groups. And they said, you shall not tit godadu, you shall not make agudot, many groups. The essence of the verse, as we explained, do not make a wound for a corpse, whereas this is like a homily. And likewise, that which they said in Sanhedrin, one who maintains a disagreement transgresses a negative commandment, as it is stated, don't be like Korach and his congregation. That is also a homiletical angle. It's not strictly a legal issue. These are more what you might call hashkafa. These are a kind of problem of outlook, of philosophy, of relationships. It's not a strictly legal one, but they use the verse, and especially a play on word for the verse. It's funny, agudah, the agudah is a group. So an agudah means a collection of people together. Lo tit godadu means do not be like separate groups. It's sort of ironic that agudah, like Agudas Yisrael, or igud harabanim, these are terms for organizations. So organizations use this word. It's sort of ironic that it also can, by talking about groups, it can mean you've what we would call sort of like a clique. You become a clique. This is not a positive term. This is an idea that your little group has set itself aside from other groups. So it's a little bit ironic. So if you are part of a group that has separated itself from Jewish leadership, and you have formed like a separate group in opposition from Jewish leadership, you actually do transgress a commandment, but it's not this one. It is, do not be like Korach and his congregation. Well, that's what it sounds like. It sounds like from the Gemara that you're actually transgressing a negative commandment. He's saying it's not technically a legal transgression. It's like a moral problem. It's a problem of character. However, the essence of that verse is simply to deter from this. According to what the sages explain, it is surely a negation, not a prohibition. For they explain that the content of the statement is that God may be exalted, is saying that one who will disagree and challenge the priesthood at some future time will not be punished with that which Korach was punished. That was a one-time thing. Indeed, he will be punished, like the Lord spoke through Moshe to him, meaning tzara'at, as that which he said to Moshe, place your hand in your bosom. And it is made clear that King Uzziah, who did get punished, with tzara'at, I believe. And I will now return to the primary intention of this commandment and say that the regulations of this commandment have already been explained at the end of Makos. One who transgresses this negative commandment is lashed. So again, even though you'll see places in the Gemara that expand on this verse to say that it's not only about cutting yourself at news of the dead, but it's also about not forming separatist groups within the community. He's saying that's not law. That is more about what is proper from a philosophical perspective, what we would call hashkafa. It's also interesting because at one point, either during the time of the Mishnah, sometimes it seems like during the time of the Mishnah, but either close to when the Mishnah is published or before, they did have two halachic categories of people. One was somebody they call the chaver, the brother or sister, or friend, literally. And the other one is the Am Haaretz. Literally, that means people of the land, but in rabbinic language, it's pejorative. It means somebody who is not on a scholarly path and not interested in the details of practice, not scrupulous about their mitzvah observance. So it's just interesting because they created these categories and they have halachic ramifications, at least with regard to rabbinic law. They do have halachic ramifications, which group you belong to, as far as, can you trust this person to say that something is kosher? Can you trust to say that this has been tithed, etc.? So the actual formation of different groups or divisions is obviously not always a problem. So that would be something to explore if you were trying to come up with, let's say you wanted to start a political party. and you're in a political party in opposition, are you being like Korah? Okay, this one is close to home for the Rambam. That he prohibited us from dwelling in the land of Egypt forever, so that we not learn from their practices and not follow their disgraceful ways. And that is his saying, you may not return that way again. This prohibition was already repeated 3 times. They said it in the Gemara in Yerushalmi Sukkah. In 3 places did the Holy One, blessed be he, warn Israel not to return to Egypt. And at 3 times, they did return and get punished for it. Indeed, one of the 3 places is that which we mentioned. The second is by route, which I told you should not return again. And the third is for Egypt, which you have seen this day, you will never see them again. Even though it appears from the words that it is narrative, in other words, it's not a law, the tradition comes to teach us that it is a prohibition. It's already been explained in the Gemara Sukkah that Alexandria is from the cities in which it is forbidden to dwell. And from the Sea of Alexandria, the measurement of the perimeter of Egypt is 400 parsecs by 400 parsecs. That is the total land of Egypt in which it is forbidden to dwell. It is permissible to travel there for business or to pass through it to a different land. And an explanation, they said in the Yerushalmi, you may not return for living, but you may return for business and to conquer the land, which is good. I just want to. He does acknowledge there's some famous letter where he says that he violates this commandment by living in Egypt. Just want to see for 1 second. Okay. I asked from the AI from Perplexity that I've been using. The question I asked is, what were the main arguments the Rambam uses to justify living in Egypt? Yeah, I don't know. It does have a source here. All right. This time the AI had a source, and the source looks like an interesting one. So let's go there to this source. happened there? What just happened? Did I leave Zoom? Are you still there? Are you guys
We're
still
here.
there? Oh, okay.
Your picture
I'm here.
disappeared,
I'm
but you're
still
here.
here.
You're there.
Okay.
It's a pussycat.
Yeah, okay. That's Liz.
No, actually, that's Max.
Okay. All right, let's try this. I will say one of the things that I found using that AI search is I don't have to be as precise when I'm asking a question. So it's been very good at sort of intuiting my question, which is cool. Let's try this. It's a little, oh, there it is. Ramosha Tarragon. The Mechilta, which is a halachic midrash, on Parshat Beshalach announces, on 3 occasions the Torah warns against returning to Egypt. Yet the Jewish people violated this decree, and each time they were severely punished. So that was quoted by the Rambam in his in what we just read. The Mechilta refers to a verse in Beshalach in which Hashem promises the Egyptians that the Egyptians would not be seen again after being drowned in the sea. A second pasuk appears in the description of a king in Parshat Shoftim. The king cannot acquire too many horses, for that may encourage a return to Egypt, the ancient center for horse trading, which Hashem has prohibited. Finally, the Tocha, the rebuke in Ki Tavo, which is last week, threatens that we will be sold into slavery and returned to Egypt along the route which Hashem warned us against. Conceivably, these verses have been interpreted as descriptive rather than normative or obligatory. Like the Rambam was saying, you might think these are just narratives. They're just telling you what's going to happen. They're not actually halachic. In Beshalach, Hashem assures us of the defeat of the Egyptians. In Shoftim, he bans indulgence in horses to prevent an unhealthy but legal return to Egypt. In Kisavo, the Torah declares the nadir of our suffering in our return to Egypt. None of these psukim unconditionally prohibits return. In fact, the Bavli, the Talmud Bavli, does not cite this violation, though the Jerusalem Talmud does. However, based on the Mechilta's impulse, the majority of Rishonim, and the Rambam is included, in one variety or another, concluding a prohibition of returning to Egypt. And this conclusion begs a famous question. What warrant or right allowed Jews throughout the ages to live in Egypt? Jewish residence in Egypt spans the millennia and includes prestigious figures, including none other than the Rambam himself. And there are reports that the Rambam signed his correspondence lamenting himself as a person who daily violates 3 prohibitions. However, the overwhelming popularity of Egyptian residence among Jews elicited a range of different justifications. The smog, so he is writing a book of mitzvos before the Rambam, claims that subsequent to Sancheriv's repopulation of the Mediterranean crescent, the prohibition to visit Egypt was lifted, since Egypt no longer contained the original Egyptian populace. Residence became permissible. In fact, the Rambam allows contemporary Egyptians entry into the Jewish population as converts, despite the biblical injunction. Regularly, you'd have to wait till the third generation before they could marry a Jew. But the Rambam apparently holds that they don't have to anymore, because the people that we see as Egyptians are no longer the same Egyptians. After all, he reasons, current Egyptians bear no legacy to the ancient community which enslaved us. In fact, the Rambam, in his comments to Negative Commandment 48 of Sefer Mitzvahs, actually describes the prohibition as stemming from contact with the Egyptian population. The chinuch, as well, typically in agreement with the Rambam, as to the basis of a mitzvah, in his comments to Mitzvah 500, bases the prohibition upon cultural assimilation. Many object to this justification on two counts. Firstly, it is unclear that Sancheriv's efforts impacted Egypt demographically. The Medrash elaborates that Egyptians were ultimately repatriated. Proof is cited from the Gemara in Sukkah, which attributes the elimination of the Jewish population of Alexandria to their violation of this issue. Since they were clearly punished after Sancheriv's reign, the population of Egypt was evidently restored and the violation was reinstated. So if Jews are being punished for staying in Egypt, and staying in Egypt is that's happening after Sancheriv had lived, so it must be that even after Sancheriv, who himself was the Assyrian king who took away the 10 tribes, after Sancheriv, it seems to have still been forbidden to live in Egypt. This could explain the Rambam's lament about living in daily violation. Although he clearly defined the mitzvah as stemming from contact with the Egyptian population, he recognized that the original population had been repatriated. More importantly, this justification assumes that the issue is based upon contact with the Egyptian populace, while the pasuk in Bishalach doesn't target the Egyptians. The other two speak of the country of Egypt. If the prohibition is defined as returning to the land of Egypt and not as resuming contact with Egyptians, Sancheriv's actions would be irrelevant. Rabbi Eliezer from Metz, a medieval author of a book known as Sefer Yereim, which enumerates the 613 mitzvahs, offers a different defense of the practice of living in Egypt. The Torah prohibits returning to Egypt from Israel and reversing the Exodus process. In a sense, the prohibition is historical and not cultural. The Exodus process was so seminal that Hashem legislated against its reversal. The communities who migrated to Egypt, with the exception of the Rambam, did so from other countries other than Israel and were immune to this prohibition. So again, according to him, the problem is returning to Egypt from Israel, but not going to Egypt from another country. But again, the Rambam was in Israel and then ended up in Egypt because on his sort of trip to find a home, they had gone into Israel, but you couldn't really live in Israel at that time. The Crusaders were in Israel at that time, and it was not a place conducive to Jewish living. A slightly different but similar defense is provided by the Ritvos, one of the Spanish scholars, 1300s, in Yuma, or whatever, end of the 1200s, 1300s, in Yuma, who claims that the Isser applies only when Jews are settled in Israel. In effect, the prohibition is not cultural or even historical, but rather Zionistic, to encourage residents in Israel through discouraging it in local, but sometimes financially more attractive Egypt. Baruch Hashem, we have advanced to the redemptive state where the Israeli economy, the economic reality has been inverted. You do much better living in Israel than you do in Egypt. Despite their differences, the Ritva and Rebbe Lezer from Metz each view the prohibition as geographical and not cultural. Sanskera's population relocation would not impact the prohibition. Evidently, there are two different views of this prohibition. The Rambam believes that the prohibition is geared towards immunizing us from Egyptian culture. And the verse in Achremot acknowledges, as the verse in Achremot acknowledges, the Egyptian culture displayed a vulgarity which endangered Jewish sanctity. Similarly, we were enjoined against actual return to prevent this type of assimilation. By contrast, the simple view adopted by the Ritva and Rebbe Lezer Mimetz cast the prohibition as geographic. Another potential question surrounds the viability of this prohibition under the Jewish conquest of Egypt. The Rambam in the Laws of Kings claims that under Jewish conquest, this prohibition will be lifted. And this further confirms the Rambam's view that the prohibition is cultural. Under Jewish sovereignty, the cultural impact will be less threatening. Presumably, Jewish culture would dominate the society, and even unchanged Egyptian vulgarity would be tempted by Jewish culture. If, however, the prohibition was geographic, this exemption becomes less likely. Simple conquest would not lift or change the status of the country. For this to occur, the conquest would have to fulfill certain conditions necessary for lands to be annexed to Israel. Presumably, the Rambam did not demand these conditions and admitted this exception because he viewed the prohibition as cultural. Yet another difference concerns a quote from the Jerusalem Talmud, which permits temporary return to Egypt for business or other non-residential purposes. This allowance can be justified regardless of the basis of the prohibition. Even if the prohibition is geographic, temporary violation may not be considered residence and would not violate the injunction. However, the Rambam claims that even if a person remains in Egypt permanently, he does not receive lashes since he has not performed an action, because living permanently is not an active state. It's a passive state, I guess. When he descends to Egypt, he's not yet violated the prohibition. That could be an active gesture, but that's not necessarily forbidden to actually visit Egypt. The problem is living there. And when he remains in violation, he's not executed an action, but has merely remained by inertia. Indeed, if the prohibition is cultural, this schedule may eliminate the prospect of lashes. The essence of the prohibition occurs during residence and exposure to Egyptian culture. This prohibition develops without a definitive action. Even though an action of migration launches the process, it will be considered a prohibition without an action. By contrast, if we view the prohibition as geographical, may say that you still do get lashes. Even though time must pass to render the stays residential than itinerant, the essence of the prohibition has already been violated upon entering the land. Time must elapse to cement the process as permanent rather than fleeting. So according to the Rambam, the duration introduced the assimilation and introduced the gist of the Isser. According to other opinion, the actual prohibition, the Isser, was executed through the immediate descent to Egypt. The prohibition has been carried out through an act of migration. As long as the stay becomes consolidated, this may be classified as a prohibition that has no act associated with it. I'm sorry, a prohibition that does have an act. So
Rab-
to
Rabbi-
review.
Yes, I was going to just say, can
Okay, review.
Can you say this in English now?
Yeah, let's say it in English. We read in the Rambam that you're not allowed to return to Egypt.
Okay, got it.
Now, he himself lived in Egypt. So the question is, how is he living in Egypt? What he's writing over here that you can't. Now, he may not have been living in Egypt when he wrote this. I don't know. But clearly, he wouldn't live somewhere if you're not allowed to live there. So there are apparently correspondence that they know of where the Rambam says, every day I transgress 3 prohibitions, and they are the 3 prohibitions connected with returning to Egypt. It could be he's saying it more as in spirit than technical, because at least how Rabbi Tarragon is presenting it, it could be that if, first of all, there is an opinion that it doesn't apply anymore. He doesn't seem to hold like that opinion, but there is an opinion like that because the Egyptians are no longer the same Egyptians. And that's a problematic thing to say, but the Rambam does paskin that way as far as Egyptian converts go. That's just the notion that a mitzvah may not apply anymore because the world has changed is a sort of interesting subject. Another thing could be that if you can't live in Israel, you have no choice. In other words, the only reason we don't want you to live in Egypt is because we want you to live in Israel. If you can't live in Israel, like during his time when the Crusaders are around, it's not safe. So then it may not be a problem to live in Egypt. Another thing, another potential permit is if you're not there for the duration. Now, the Rambam does seem to have been there for the duration. Not only did he live the rest of his life in Egypt, but his son continued to live in Egypt after him, Rabbi Avram ben Rambam. The bulk of this article by Rabbi Tarragon was 2 underlying ways to view this prohibition. One is that it's just about the land of Egypt. It's not about the people of Egypt. God doesn't want us to go back to Egypt. He doesn't want to reverse the Exodus. He just doesn't want us to go back there, not because of the nature of the people, but just because he doesn't want us to go back to Egypt. The other way of looking at it is that this is about the Egyptian people. They had a particular type of corruption about them that made them particularly dangerous for the Jewish people, a corrupting influence for the Jewish people. So he was just going back and forth, trying to figure out if you could distinguish between the different opinions about this, whether they hold that the primary concern is the nature of the people or the primary concern is just the geography. But apparently everybody agrees you can visit there. Everybody seems to agree you can do business there. This is about living there permanently. He even spent a little bit of time trying to figure out if you get lashes for this particular mitzvah, negative commandment, should you choose to live there, and would the way that you look at this, if it's primarily about the land or primarily about the people, would that influence that? So that is that. It is something that comes up. It used to be very common for Jews to visit Egypt. This is post the peace treaty with Sadat, up until a couple years ago, it was, as you guys know, it was a popular place for Jews to visit. And the question would always come up, am I allowed to? It says you're not supposed to go back to Egypt. All righty. I am grateful for having this opportunity to learn with you guys. I look forward to doing it again tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right. Be well,
Sounds
guys.
like a plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.